Welcome back to section 5. This is the 5th of the 6 parts of this package. This is a slightly longer section, and in it we've embedded some activities that require you to stop this particular presentation, go away, undertake some activities and then come back again. So, after you've formulated a question, there's a need to identify evidence-based resources that answer the question. We'll look now at some approaches to doing this and think about some of the challenges along the way. Before we do, I want to remind you of 2 things. First of all, it's not the case that no evidence is bad evidence. No evidence just means there isn't evidence yet and provides an opportunity for research to take place. Nor is it the case that all evidence is created equal. You've no doubt seen the hierarchies of research evidence, and we'll look at one of those shortly. So, some evidence is considered much stronger than other evidence. We need to look at these hierarchies of evidence from the perspective of the types of populations that we work with, bearing in mind that the hierarchies are generally developed for the medical field, which places randomised controlled trials at the very highest level of evidence. We need to be comfortable in saying that randomised controlled trials aren't always possible with our populations. Many of our populations have small numbers. Many of our populations are very complex, and that makes it difficult to achieve the numbers that are needed for randomised controlled trials and the conditions sometimes that are needed for those trials as well. But let's take a look now at how we get at the best available external evidence from systematic research. There are 3 aspects I'm going to talk about with you today. The first is how to go about accessing the external evidence. Secondly, we'll look at evaluating the external evidence. And finally, we'll look at some ways to access and use pre-evaluated evidence. This is one of the strategies that might help you deal with the time barrier. Accessing external evidence. You have to find the evidence and then you have to get hold of it, if you're looking for primary sources, that is. When you were at university, accessing the external evidence, finding the external evidence was relatively easy. University libraries these days have a fantastic array of databases that you can search to find particular evidence, and then they link you straight to the electronic journals so that you can download the papers and read them. It's brilliant. In your working life, you might not have the same level of fantastic access to evidence, but there are some approaches you can take. You'll see on the slide links to 2 databases which will allow you to search for evidence. The first is PubMed and the second is something called TRIP database. Spend some time now exploring these sites. Search for papers that might help you to answer the questions that you want to address. Have a look at the tools that these sites provide you with. Are there alerts you can sign up for? Can you get the database to send you information every time something in your area of interest arises? Do any of them link to the full papers? Often you can read the abstract, but you may not be able to get hold of the full paper, but sometimes you can get hold of the paper. I'd advise that you spend a good 20 to 30 minutes having a look at these. They're really useful tools for you. How did you get on with investigating those 2 sites? You might have noticed that the search terms you put in make a difference. So if one search term doesn't work, think of something else. If you put in aphasia and nothing comes up, try stroke. You might get something. You might also have noticed on TRIP database that you have the option to do a PICO search. So you could plug in your very own PICO question and see what evidence it brings up for you. I think these 2 are valuable tools and would encourage you to continue to work on using them. Let's talk now about evaluating the external evidence. There are some frameworks for doing this evaluation, and I'll direct you to those shortly. But first of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the key things that need to be evaluated. You'll want to ask yourself, is the question well formed, or are the questions well formed? And is the type of research reported suited to the question? We might be confident that the journal we're looking at is a reputable one with excellent review processes, but it's still worth asking yourself the questions about the quality of what you're reading. Quality is going to be shown in different ways depending on the different type of research. For example, in a quantitative study, a randomised control trial is useful, and within that randomised control trial, you're going to look for blinding. So that is that people undertaking the assessments aren't aware of which group the subject is in, or that the participant doesn't know which group they belong to. The sample size is important, and the power of the study needs to be large. All of these things should be reported in the study. Qualitative studies are different, and qualitative studies are important for us within our profession, especially in this era when we're encouraged to think about quality of life and long-term outcomes for our clients. You'll need to look to make sure in a qualitative study that measures have been taken to ensure that the participant perceptions are adequately reported and interpreted correctly. This may well involve something called participant checking, where transcriptions are taken back to the participants for them to indicate whether they're correct or not, or to give them the opportunity to make some changes. You'll also need to see an audit trail. You'll need to know how the researcher made decisions. And finally, the participant should be provided with the opportunity to correct the final transcript. You'll need to look at the results and make sure that the results are expressed clearly and that they make sense, and that the conclusions drawn from those results are appropriate. So I promised you a look at some frameworks for evaluating the external evidence. On the screen, you'll see a slide with links to some external frameworks that will help you to evaluate the external evidence. The top two links come from the Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine. Note, medicine, so they're heavily medically oriented. The top link takes you to their 2009 evidence hierarchy, and the second link takes you to their 2011 update of that hierarchy. The 2011 update takes a slightly different approach in that it looks at the levels of evidence in relation to particular questions. I really like that approach, so I suggest you have a look at that one. The link takes you actually to a PDF. It's worth going to the Evidence-Based Medicine website in order to find the introductory statement that will orient you to that particular PDF. The third link takes you to the National Health and Medical Research Council framework, heavily based on the Oxford framework, but this one's used within Australia. In looking at the frameworks, you'll need to understand a number of concepts. So let me just orient you to these concepts now. So some key concepts in research design. I'm sure you're familiar with the notion of quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative research reports numbers, essentially, and qualitative research is more likely to tell you about the perceptions of clinicians or to give you some deeper sort of understanding of what's going on. Some studies adopt a mixed methods approach and will report both quantitative and qualitative information. Two other research design concepts that are important to bear in mind are the notions of treatment efficacy and treatment effectiveness. Treatment efficacy reports treatment that takes place under well-controlled conditions. So much of what you read in the external research reports treatment efficacy. Treatment effectiveness is what you need to be looking at in your clinical practice. So there's an interesting disconnect there that you need to be aware of. Interpreting the results section tends to be challenging for many of us. Here are some brief suggestions that will help you with some of the results that you'll find in research papers these days. Effect size is now fairly routinely reported in quantitative studies, and this reflects the magnitude of a finding, so the extent to which we can be sure that the null hypothesis is false. It's usually reported, well, perhaps not usually, it's often reported as Cohen's d, and Cohen's d compares the mean of different groups. We talk about effect sizes as small, medium, or large. Using Cohen's d, a small effect size is around 0.2, medium is around 0.5, and large is around 0.8. A large effect size is generally preferable. In studies that use correlation, Pearson's R will often be reported. Correlation tells you about the relationship between two variables, but doesn't imply causality, and it's important to remember this when you're reading the research. A Pearson's R of 0 indicates that there's no relationship at all between the variables, while 1 indicates a perfect linear relationship. You might also see reported the percentage of variation in one measure that can be explained by variation in another. Odds ratio is reported when we want to compare the probability of binary outcomes. So it compares the odds of an outcome in one group with the odds in another. An odds ratio of 1 means that the odds were the same in both groups. The sorts of binary outcomes that might be reported are recovered or did not recover, did or did not receive treatment. Higher odds means that the likelihood is higher in the first group than in the second, and the number can be infinitely large. Finally, you'll sometimes see reported measures of sensitivity and specificity. These are relevant within diagnostic studies. So, sensitivity tells us the likelihood of identification of those who have a disorder, while specificity tells us the likelihood of identification of those without a disorder. It's expressed as a percentage or as a decimal. The higher the percentage, or the closer to 1, the better the result. So, we've now explained some of the concepts and we've directed you to some of the frameworks for evaluating a paper. Stop the presentation now and have a go at applying one of the frameworks to the evaluation of a paper that you've read recently. It might be a paper that you found that relates to the PICO question you developed earlier. You'll need to spend, I estimate, at least half an hour on this activity, but it might take you longer. If you're finding it useful, valuable, challenging even, you might like to apply the framework to more than one paper just to get your hand in at doing it. When you've finished with that, come back and we'll start our look at using pre-evaluated evidence. How did you get on with using those frameworks? Before we move on to look at pre-evaluated evidence, I'd like to share with you another site that might be useful to you in doing some evaluations. The link on your screen takes you to a site that provides a list of checklists that you can use to evaluate different types of evidence. The checklists are clearly labelled qualitative evidence, checklist for randomised controlled trials, and similar things. Something that would be worth having a look at. You might find these quicker than using the frameworks that you examined previously. There's no doubt that evaluating the evidence takes some time, so it's useful to be able to look at evidence that has been evaluated for you. Let's do that now. The slide on your screen now provides you with links to a number of sites where you can find evidence that has already been evaluated. You can search these sites in various ways. Some of them I hope you're familiar with already. The second link takes you to SpeechBite, and Australian initiative that's available internationally and is supported by Speech Pathology Australia. You can search this site to find evidence in a number of different areas. The first link takes you to the New South Wales EBP network site, and they too provide us with pre-evaluated evidence, critically appraised topics and critically appraised papers around a range of different areas. Worth looking at. The third link takes you to ASH's EBP pages, and these are an amazing resource. Among the information that's freely available on this site are evidence maps, which take you into the evidence for particular areas of practice. There's also a listing of systematic reviews. I encourage you, when you have the time, to spend a good amount of time exploring what's in here, and also bookmark it in your mind as somewhere you can go to look for evidence. EBP briefs also will provide you with some information in particular areas. The final link takes you to a journal, Evidence-Based Communication Assessment and Intervention. While the papers in this journal aren't always free, sometimes there are ones that are available free of cost. And SPA members also get a discount if they want to subscribe to this journal. So a resource that's worth bearing in mind. So our final activity for this section is for you to spend that time exploring the sites that provide pre-evaluated evidence. Have a look at the sort of information that's available. Have a think about the search terms that will help you to find the evidence that you need. Check out whether you can sign up to alerts or newsletters that will help you keep in touch with research in your area of interest. And again, take the opportunity to look specifically for evidence related to the question you asked earlier. When you come back to begin section 6 of this package, you'll be looking at ways you can use your own practice to contribute to the evidence base.